Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you today. I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the president of the Hanmam Seon Foundation, Venerable Haisu Sunim, to the headmaster, Venerable Haisol Sunim, to the manager of the Hammam Science Institute, Venerable Haichan Sunim, and the vice director, Yang Hee Lee. And I would also like to apologize for my Korean pronunciation. It's my honor to follow Ambassador Abdullah Saif al-Naimi and Ambassador Akivatur. Their remarks, I think, were very important this morning. The UAE's efforts to promote tolerance and respect and harmony are very important in the world today. And Ambassador Tour's discussion of human dignity resonates deeply with my heart. For the last 5 years, our center has been focusing on the concept of human dignity as a way of building bridges to create cultures of dignity around the world, and as also a foundational principle for human rights in general and for freedom of religion and belief in particular. One of our efforts was to help work on the Punta del Este Declaration on Human Dignity for Everyone, Everywhere. And this declaration was adopted in 2018 on the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and seeks to restore and return human rights discourse to its foundational principles as a way of depoliticizing human rights and also trying to create bridges to places where human rights are somewhat suspect. Next year already will be the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we will be again working on projects related to human dignity. One of particular interest here may be a project focusing on Asian conceptions of human dignity. In China alone, each of the classical schools of thought, Confucian, Tao, and Moism, each have important concepts of dignity at the heart of their understandings of humanity. And yet, this has largely been lost in Chinese civilization. We believe also that in Korea, Japan, and other places in Asia, there may be understandings of human dignity that it's important for others in the world to understand. In addition, we'll be leading a project on Islamic conceptions of human dignity and another project on the Abrahamic faiths and their conceptions of human dignity. So the overlaps and interplay for Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And so, Ambassador Tour, it was wonderful to hear your emphasis on the principle of human dignity. I've been asked to talk about the coronavirus pandemic and what it has meant for us as societies. And the metaphor to which I have been drawn is that of an institutional stress test. My remarks will focus primarily on the United States. I'm not an expert on Korea, so you'll be able to engage in your own comparative analysis. Perhaps you remember in high school, at least when I was in high school, we had a science competition where we were each given a piece of balsa wood, and we were asked to construct a bridge out of that very soft and malleable material. And then a weight was placed upon the bridge, increasing in pressure until the bridge collapsed. And the winner was the bridge that could bear the most weight. I've come to view COVID-19 as something of a stress test upon our institutions, our governmental institutions, our religious institutions, media, business, education, virtually all of our institutions have been subject to considerable stress. The pandemic in the United States is something you've probably followed in the news, but I don't think we have been a model for handling these stresses. The United States has experienced about 16% of worldwide cases of COVID-19, more than 94 million. There have also been more than 1 million deaths in the United States, accounting for 16% of the deaths worldwide. The United States, in contrast, accounts for only 4% of the world's population. So our representation on both of these numbers is about 4 times higher than global averages would suggest they should be. Now, some of this may be due to reporting and keeping of statistics, but that cannot be all of it. I think we must look and reflect in a critical way upon the way that we have handled the stress tests of the coronavirus pandemic. Religion in the pandemic has been a particular focus of my scholarly interest. And as I have thought about the response and the treatment of religion in the coronavirus pandemic, I have several observations to share. The first is that there is no blanket exemption for religious groups for restrictions on gathering or other types of health-based restrictions. Yes, freedom of religion and belief is a fundamental right, but it is not an absolute right. It may be limited in appropriate ways and under appropriate circumstances. And under international human rights instruments, public health is one of the legitimate bases for limiting religious freedom. In the United States as well, any compelling government interest, including public health, is a basis for limitation. Now, I should say that in the United States, there has been a little bit of a double standard. When outbreaks of COVID were traced to religious groups, there was an early outbreak in New York City that was traced to Orthodox Jewish communities. Those communities were often targeted as being especially dangerous and especially virulent centers of spreading disease. And it was interesting because around the same time, another outbreak was happening in Boston at a scientific convention. And the number of people who were infected in that gathering was actually similar to the number of people who were affected in the Orthodox neighborhoods. But the treatment of those outbreaks by the media could not have been more different. The treatment of the scientific conference was as if this was just an unfortunate side effect of a legitimate gathering, whereas the outbreak that was connected to traditional religious communities was treated as pathological. In the United States, we remember hearing about early outbreaks in Korea that may have also targeted unpopular religious groups for special condemnation. There are legal strategies for addressing and protecting religious freedom, even at times of stress, even at times such as the coronavirus pandemic. I will mention 3 of those principles. The first is the rule of law, basic principles of non-discrimination. The second is the principle of reasonable accommodation. And the third is the legitimate bases for limiting religious freedom when there is a compelling state interest and when there is no less restrictive means of achieving that interest. First, the baseline principles of rule of law. This is pretty basic. When the government acts, it needs to do so pursuant to legal authority. Sometimes, in times of emergency and stress, the emergency is felt so severely that the basic principles of rule of law can be forgotten. And you sometimes get something like decrees or just simple wielding of power that can break and violate even the most basic rules of the rule of law. We saw this occasionally around the world, although for the most part, the emergency powers granted to governments are quite robust. And so in the early days of the emergency especially, when the scope, causes, risks of the danger are not well understood, muscular and responsive government action is understandable. As time passes, of course, and as the risks are better understood, the amount of deference that should be given to governments with respect to emergency powers will gradually decrease. The second basic fundamental starting principle is non-discrimination. Religious activities should be treated at least as favorably as similar secular activities. Now, figuring out what is relevantly similar is not always easy. But when we think of religious gatherings, we might think of other gatherings, such as theaters or concerts. And the same types of limitations that exist in those settings ought not be less restrictive than the restrictions that apply to religious gatherings. In the United States, for example, early on, courts were very deferential to the government as it limited religious freedom. But in time, economic interests pressed for liberalization of these limits. And so, for example, in Nevada, casinos were reopened at a time when church gatherings were still prohibited. When that case made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that this inconsistent treatment was unconstitutional because it was treating religion less favorably than gambling. Now, the casinos argued that it was different, that in religious gatherings people were in close proximity and stayed there for a long time, sometimes an hour or more. To which the response is, that sounds like a lot like standing around a table betting or playing cards in a casino as well. One of the things that saddened me the most is when limitations on touching, for blessings, for last rites, were more restrictive than limitations for tattoo parlors or massage parlors or even prostitution. In Belgium, for a long time, it was illegal for a priest to touch a parishioner while the prostitution houses had been opened out of public necessity. This seems to me to get our priorities exactly backwards. The second basic principle is reasonable accommodation. In time, it usually becomes possible to be sensitive to the special needs of religious communities. Sometimes those needs relate to diet, or to religious attire, or sacred holidays and rituals. In a state that cares about religious freedom, there will be an effort to begin accommodating those legitimate religious needs, even at a time when general prohibitions on gathering still exist. one of the things that made me realize that our priorities in the United States were backwards was that in Germany, the schools reopened at a time when bars and restaurants remained closed. In the United States, it was opposite. The schools remained closed when the bars and restaurants were able to reopen. And just now, we are beginning to grapple with the learning deficits that occurred because of the imperfections of online learning, and especially the differences in the impact of online learning on wealthy versus poor children. It turns out that for the most vulnerable communities, the failure to reopen the schools was the most acute. And we heard many stories of hypocrisy where school board members were voting to keep the schools closed while they were sending their children to private schools that were already gathering in person. The way we treat our children, I think, is an important measure of whether we have our priorities correct. And I cannot help but be quite critical of the United States priorities in this regard. And frankly, some of the blame falls upon the powerful teachers' unions, who were often writing the government regulations restricting activities in schools at a time when it was quite clear from the scientific evidence that the risk of transmission and the risk of serious illness to children was quite a bit lower. Now, this isn't to say there was no risk, but we did not do a good job of balancing the risks of COVID against the other risks of isolation, the risks of lost learning. When we think about accommodations, there are three very different attitudes that we might adopt. In the United States, we have laws which require reasonable accommodation of religion in a variety of circumstances, but usually those accommodations are viewed as unfortunate exceptions to general and neutral rules. And so the accommodations are issued begrudgingly and only after much effort on behalf of the group seeking an accommodation. In other places, I think France may be an example of this, accommodations are viewed as adjustments that religious communities must make in order to comply with the general and neutral norms. And so prohibitions on headscarves for Muslim women or kippah for Jewish men are viewed as prohibiting those expressions in public is an accommodation the religious people are expected to make in the name of equal citizenship for all. But there's a third way of thinking about accommodation. It's what I am receiving here as a guest in Korea. It is the accommodation we find at a hotel. I am being accommodated. I am given a place where I am safe, where I can rest and sleep without a gun under my pillow, and where I can feel that even though I am a stranger, my needs are being taken into account. Unfortunately, in the United States, I don't think we think of accommodation with this ethic of hospitality. Rather, we tend to think of an accommodation under an ethic of rights. And so, when I'm speaking in the United States about reasonable accommodation, I'm often urging us to shift our perspective. The third legal principle is the compelling state interest and least restrictive means test. This basically says that if religious freedom is being restricted, the state must show two things. First, that there is a compelling interest served by the restrictions, and public health is surely one of those compelling state interests. But the more interesting and important part of the test is whether there is a less restrictive means of securing that interest. This is sometimes called narrow tailoring. This is often not the case. It turns out that sometimes the limitations we place are greater than what is really necessary to secure the interest. And again, I think we can sense this when we see differential treatment. If other gatherings are treated more favorably than religious gatherings, then the compelling state interest test would not be satisfied. Now, in the United States, responses of religious communities to these government rules varied somewhat. For the most part, the responses were pluralistic. Much of the regulation of religion and other gatherings that took place came not from a unified national approach, but from various states and localities. And there was quite a variety, and most of them had tiered response systems that were implemented to vary the degree of restrictions based upon the level of current infections. For the most part, faith communities exhibited attitudes of cooperation and caution. Many faith communities, most really, swiftly and voluntarily imposed restrictions on themselves that met or exceeded government regulations. On the other hand, there were some religious groups that challenged government coronavirus restrictions in the courts. There were dozens of cases. For the most part, early in the pandemic, courts were very deferential to the government, and these challenges by religious organizations were unsuccessful. Over time, as we learned more about COVID-19, courts focused less on deference and more on equal treatment. And I think this was an appropriate and understandable shift over time. Often overlooked are the positive efforts that many religious communities made to give spiritual and mental health support to people who are suffering during the coronavirus. Some studies have indicated that anxiety and depression levels increased fourfold during the pandemic. And many faith communities were very proactive in addressing the mental and spiritual health needs of their congregations. In addition, many religious communities were at the forefront of humanitarian responses to the pandemic, doing things like creating face masks early on when they were underproduced, or providing shelter to a homeless population, or to provide food packets that met the dietary requirements of different communities. One thing that we saw on display was the indispensable role that religious institutions play in society in unifying and strengthening communities at times of crisis. As important as the legal strategies are for dealing with coronavirus, it may be the non-legal strategies that are also important for us to reflect upon. Again, I will mention three. First, the importance of patience, forbearance, and restraint. Secondly, the importance of being a light in times of darkness. And thirdly, the concept of human dignity for all people at all times in all places. First, patience, forbearance, and restraint. Many of us had different perspectives on the appropriate response to the coronavirus pandemic, and many of us were quite intolerant of those who did not share our perspective. Even in our religious communities, those who refused to wear face masks seemed very uncaring for the interests of those who were vulnerable, especially to illness and infection. And on the other hand, those who believed strongly in taking very cautious precautions were often very intolerant of those who viewed things differently. As we've learned more about what works and what doesn't work in controlling the spread of the coronavirus, we come to understand that zealots on both sides were probably mistaken. I had a high school friend named Mark McKinney, and he became a high school football coach, American football. And he died when he was about 40 years old of heart failure. But before he died, he invited me to attend one of the high school football games. His team had lost every game that year, and it was the last game of the season. And they lost that game too. But I remember my friend Mark for this. He got into the locker room before the game, during halftime of the game, at the end of the game, and he preached one thing. He said, "Let's be classy." Now, that may not translate easily, but it basically means let's behave with dignity. Let's behave with self-respect as well as respect for our opponents. And oftentimes, when I see the way we react, especially when we're upset, maybe we're losing, the temptation to not behave with self-respect can be very great. Secondly, is the idea of being a light. In the Christian tradition, Jesus taught, "Ye are the light of the world." He also taught, "I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." And in John, the scriptures teach, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." This, I think, is common to virtually all religious traditions. The idea of being a light resonates in the Abrahamic faiths, and I believe it resonates very deeply within Buddhist faith as well. Finally, the idea of human dignity. If we always strive to treat each other with dignity and respect, we may not always get every detail of our responses correct, but it will help point us in the right direction. Human dignity, we believe, is uniquely generative. Really, everyone can add something to our understanding of what human dignity is and what human dignity means. Another thing we've noticed about human dignity is that it tends to lift discourse from division to consensus. In our discussion of rights, including important human rights, it's very easy for our discussions to descend and to become argumentative and to end up in the ditch. But if we focus on dignity, it's almost impossible for us not to think about the other as well as ourselves, and our discourse tends to be elevated. So let me conclude. And I'm sorry to say I need to conclude on a somber note. Because as I think about the coronavirus crisis in the United States, yes, I think of it as a health crisis. But perhaps more importantly and more lasting, it has been a crisis of trust. Trust is foundational to all of our important relationships, be it marriage, business, civic, or even ecclesiastical relationships. When we stop trusting each other and our institutions, our relationships and our institutions will fall apart. responsible institutions have now been proven to be more trustworthy. But those worthy of mistrust have seen their levels of trust, the levels of lack of trust, increase dramatically. And so, I believe that most of our important institutions, the government, the press, our public health authorities, some of our religious institutions, some of our business institutions, many of our educational institutions have lost a good share of the public trust over the course of the pandemic. There are admirable exceptions to this rule, but for the losers, those who have lost trust, this is very sobering, because trust, once lost, can be very difficult to regain. Thank you.
예, 그 코로나 팬데믹이 장기화되면서 얻어지는 이제
With this stress due to prolonged and extended period of pandemic, I believe this professor's discourse on the legal and non-legal responses to a corona pandemic, and his speech that trust will be the fundamental element of all relationship. It was very touching and impressive. Now is a brief Q&A session. So those who have questions, please go ahead.
예, 이창수 교수님.
Professor Chang-Soo Lee.
예, 자유권 수호를 위한 어떤 그 법적 비법적 전략을 이렇게 아주 명확하게
I have heard your insights on legal and non-legal approaches to our freedom of human rights.
Be light.
Yes, I heard be light, reflect light. And I forgot the other one. When you talked about non-legal strategies, and yes, I heard you speak that there are common elements in Buddhist religion. In Buddhism, the actual practice, putting the ideas into action. So I would like your brief answer on the purpose of all these activities.
I'm not sure I understand your question entirely. I had a daughter who was a Mormon missionary during coronavirus, and she was serving in the German Alpine Mission, which is a German-speaking mission in southern Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And during the pandemic, in many parts of the world, missionaries were sent home because there was not much they could do when they were confined to their apartments. My daughter spent 10 weeks confined entirely to her apartment, only able to leave one time a week to go shopping for food. And it was very interesting to see the efforts they made to be support to each other and to continue their work at a time when it was very difficult. They conducted meetings on the phone, through social media, through Zoom, but they were very scrupulous about following the rules in the countries where they lived. In that case, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. I think most of the foreign missionaries that serve in Korea went home early on in the pandemic. I had one neighbor whose son was in Korea, and they were sent home. And the rule from Korea was a 10-day quarantine. So he came home and spent 10 days quarantined in his bedroom before he was able to go out. So I think for all religious communities, the pandemic created remarkable challenges. And I don't know all of the details because I'm an academic, not a church leader, but I think there was an effort, I would say a good faith effort, to follow the rules and regulations in the countries where missionaries were serving. I can also say that the humanitarian efforts of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were quite remarkable during coronavirus. The level of activity in humanitarian projects was, I think, higher than it's ever been in the history of the church. Again, I'm not quite sure I understood your question, so I hope I've responded appropriately.
예, 그 질문에 대해서 적절한 답변을 해주신 것 같고요.
You have provided a very good answer to the question. If there's no question due to time constraint, we will conclude this session and let us give a big round of applause to Professor Brett Scharffs, who